Welcome to the Hey Chaplain podcast. My name is Jared Altick, and I'm a chaplain with the police department. This podcast exists so the cops can hear encouragement from other cops. You might not talk to a police chaplain, but I'm hoping that at 4:30 in the morning, as the night shift is slowing down, you might listen to a chaplain talk to other cops about being a wiser, healthier person. From the LAPD to Scotland Yard, the guests on Hey Chaplain are giving you the wisdom gleaned from their experience so you don't have to learn the hard way. Today's interview is a big get for me. I've interviewed important people in law enforcement with some amazing personal stories, but J Warner Wallace is someone who has been on my wish list from day one. First, he's a famous cold case homicide detective who has had his cases featured on television for a decade. And cold case investigation is the main topic we're going to talk about today. Second, I've listened to his podcast and have read his books for several years now, so he feels like a bit of a celebrity to me. But third, and maybe most interesting, is that he was a 35-year-old atheist police officer who applied his knowledge of solving cold cases to the Bible and then became a Christian. A police officer whose law enforcement skills led him to faith? Now that's an interesting story. So the first 20 minutes or so are about cold case investigations, how to build a case to convince a jury, how to work with a DA, how to prioritize your cases. In the second half of the interview, we transition to Jim's personal story of investigating Christianity like a cold case detective and being transformed from vocal atheist to believing Christian. And don't miss what he says at the end of the interview about working in a job full of skeptics as a new believer. Again, the religious stuff kicks in about 22 minutes in, and it's really interesting. But please don't miss one of the most famous cold case detectives in the country talking about his work. Here's J Warner Wallace. Hello, Jim. How are you today?
Doing well. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
I'm glad you're here. I'm really excited to talk to you. I have not yet talked to anybody about cold case investigations. And, well, you're kind of a big deal in that area. And so, I wanted to ask you, how did you get started down that road? How did you end up on TV? How did that work out for you?
Well, I was working in Los Angeles County. I was working robbery homicide, and I had been there about 5 years at that assignment. And most of my stuff was, you have far more robberies than you have homicides in Los Angeles County. And so a lot of my stuff was just trying to squeeze in. I had every fifth homicide and every robbery. I was buried just in robberies. But along the way, they would assign these. I had a new sergeant who was very ambitious. He ultimately became our chief. And while he was sergeant in our detail, he said, let's take a look at some of our unsolved. And we had an entire room full of unsolved murders. And back in those days, we would stick them in notebooks. And so which is probably good because you can see exactly how many you have. Yeah. And so we started to get these things assigned to us as collateral duties. Well, no one's going to work a case that's collateral when you've got fresh cases you're behind on.
Right.
So
right.
These just sat. So I think they probably sat for 3 years. We all were assigned a case. None of us worked our cases. Those are the collaterals because we were working fresh homicides.
Yeah.
So then eventually I got hurt on the job and found myself light duty for about 6 months. And in that 6-month period, I was not getting assigned new cases.
Right,
so it gave me a window, and I just took one of these cold cases and we solved it. Now we're only about, I'd say, 15 miles from NBC Universal. So they reached out to us. Dateline reached out early, said, "Do you got anything?" We had this case that we had just solved. It was pretty unusual. It was a case that was probably 84. It was probably 30 years old. That was pretty good for them. And they picked it up, and that began a run of about 10 years doing cases, all of which appeared on Dateline. We were on Dateline a lot, and that kind of helped us keep the team afloat. If you've worked in this industry, you know that this is an expensive proposition to have full-time cold case teams. A lot of these guys, like in Los Angeles County, these are usually retired. They kind of hire back, and they use that as surplus personnel to do your cold cases. To have regular sworn personnel that are dedicated to cold cases is pretty rare. So to keep it open, what I think helped us is that our city council loved the city being on a Dateline repeatedly. So that kind of kept us in business. And so we were able to do a bunch of these that we thought we'd never get to do. So my cases range anywhere from like 1979 to 1995 probably were the cases that we were looking at.
Sure.
Still have a couple of open cases. I'm sure I'll have to step back in at some point. I have not been having to do this full time for some time now. I've been writing books, but really loved the process, and you learn a lot about how to examine events that are set in history.
Well, let me ask about that, because that seems like a frustrating proposition to want to investigate a case when the original investigators are probably retired, maybe not even alive anymore.
Right.
A lot of the witnesses may not be alive anymore.
That's right.
Where do you even start? Did you have a particular technique, or did you have just a tenacity? What was it that made you successful in solving some of these cases?
Well, I think a lot of these teams that come up that do this work, they are looking for quick hits, for quick resolution, because there is so much pressure financially from the agency. Do something. I mean, if you're working a case for a year and you haven't produced a suspect, there's a good chance they're going to tell you to move on. And so a lot of the first kind of things you look at are like, well, is there anything with new DNA technology we could just knock down quickly? Now, we just didn't happen to get lucky that way. I only have one case I ever solved with DNA. So these are cases where we didn't have witnesses. If we would have had a witness back in the day, it would have got solved back in the day. So they are really terrible cases. But what we were looking at, I love it when somebody has recorded an interview, especially if I've got a potential suspect who the interview has been recorded, but they were was never enough information to file the case. So they had somebody they think might have done it. They interviewed this guy, they investigated this guy, they never produced a case, and then it kind of goes cold. I love those because before I ever worked robbery homicide, I was working in our undercover positions, and I went through all the training you could go through in terms of interviewing. And a lot of that training is about word assessment, forensic statement analysis. And so you're looking at the kinds of words that people choose that are either deception indicators, or they just give away some detail that maybe you would have missed if you weren't being really picky about the expansion of time, contraction of time, use of pronouns, use of optional words like adjectives and adverbs, all the stuff that helps us to decide if somebody's telling us the truth or not. So what we typically would do, I would look for those cases where they did interviews, and I would have them transcribed, and then I would nitpick through the interview to see if there was something hiding in plain sight. And we had a lot of success with that as our strategy. Even then, we would go back out and do fresh interviews and then nitpick those. So we that's really where that was kind of our bread and butter approach. And it is one of those death by 1,000 paper cuts where you're looking at every little thing and things that don't seem like they're they're just a single paper cut. These are cumulative, circumstantial cases with indirect evidence only. So you're building this case, and anything that's cumulative, you better be robust. And so a lot of the other thing we did with these cases was my background is weird. I have a background in the arts before I became a police officer. So a lot of this is, can I make this visually compelling for a jury so they can understand the weight of the cumulative case? Because if I just mentioned 10 reasons why this guy's guilty to you, that may not be nearly as powerful as illustrating them on a screen in some way so you can see the weight. Like, that is a pretty robust case. And if you see it visually, there's a reason why when we apprehend something rationally, we'll often say something like, I see what you mean. Right. Because if we can see it, it seems like it's more powerful than, a picture's worth 1,000 words. And so a lot of what we did was find ways to visually illustrate the strength of the case for juries.
So you were not only uncovering more evidence, more leads, more of a case to build, but you were also finding a new way to present the case.
Yeah, and I was very lucky. I had a DA who became one of my best friends, even today. But he wanted to step into the investigative world. He kind of was a frustrated detective himself. And I was a frustrated attorney. I wanted to be able to how do I articulate this to a jury? Yeah. So he would let me step into his world and build those opening statements and closing arguments. And I would let him step into my world, typically long before we ever took anybody to jail, to theorize and to strategize about how we're going to do the interview. As a matter of fact, there were a number of interviews where I invited him in to be part of that process. And if you've got a DA who's that invested in your case, it just means that the case is that much more complete. Usually when you present a case to the DA, you know the case better than the DA. And then you hope the DA gets close to your level of knowledge before he goes in front of a jury. Well, in our cases, the DA and I were like brothers. We both knew the case equally well. We had been involved in the case equally all the way through the presentation. So it made for a stronger reunion, and I think it was what gave us all that success.
If you're talking to a department that has maybe just started a cold case unit, what should they prioritize?
First thing is you have to have the financial commitment to make it a full-time position. So the collateral duty, it's never going to get the effort that it needs. It needs to be treated. Prioritized. Yeah, you need to treat each old case as though they are a case with a deadline that is a fresh case. So in order to do that, you need the people. So the question is, can you afford this? If you can, you need at least 2 people. We only had on our team, we only had 2 people working cold cases, myself and my partner. My partner changed over the 10 years I did this. But I had a partner, and we had 1 criminalist who was dedicated to us from the Los Angeles County Crime Lab. And we just paid his salary and paid his benefits, and then we had exclusive access. Because the problem you have in these cases is anytime you have something forensic, nobody wants to prioritize it at the local crime lab.
Right.
Yeah, so it just sits on their shelf and like, well, do you have a court date? Well, no, we need a result of this test before we can even file the case. Those get last priority. So you need to kind of purchase that kind of buy-in from the lab, and so we had that. Also, you need to kind of be careful about which cases you start with. You need some early success to convince your city council that this budget is worth spending. So you're going to start off with those cases where there was a known suspect, but there wasn't enough to file the case. Then, and leave your whodunits, your complete whodunits, for the bottom of your list. You want to start, or you work those parallel, but you always work them kind of prioritizing behind a case where you have a known suspect. And those cases are hard enough as it is. So then you want to be able to assess those cases. If there are DNA cases, of course, you want to do those first, because early successes will pave the road for more patience to work the more difficult cases later. So you want to do those cases first. And then in terms of partnering, you really have to have somebody. If you just file these cases with whoever is available at your DA's office, the Los Angeles DA's office is a nightmare right now, to be honest with you. The way we've got a DA who is not willing to file cases on anything anymore. He's a George Soros DA. I'm just going to be honest with you. Doesn't make for good law enforcement DAs. But I'll tell you that you need a DA at the office whose specialty is this kind of case, who becomes the same person, male or female, whoever it may be, who is he or she is going to be with you on all these cases, is going to learn with you as you make those mistakes together, and will eventually be the person, your go-to person at the office, because otherwise if you have to kind of reteach how to present difficult, cumulative, indirect cases over and over again to DAs who are learning it again for the first time every time you do a case. Look, this is why you need a committed team on the agency side, the law enforcement agency, who learns how to do cold cases. Well, you also need a dedicated DA, and those are hard to come by. So it's getting a buy-in from the local DA's office to say, you know what, okay, we'll give you a 5-year run, and here's the DA who's going to be responsible for all of your cases, and you'll learn together. You'll learn how each other works. You'll take that DA along with you on some of the most important interviews. You'll be with the DA when they're strategizing about how to present it. So that, I think, is the best recipe for success.
Most lay people outside of law enforcement, they hear circumstantial evidence, they hear bad evidence.
That's right.
And they don't understand how circumstantial evidence works. They don't understand what that means. They don't understand this cumulative case you've mentioned already. How should law enforcement communicate that? How should that be taught, not just in a courtroom, but into the community as well?
Well, part of it is, look, the community doesn't care about what evidence you assembled to make they care about wins. So when you get a case that's tried successfully and it makes the news, they think, wow, look what they're doing over there. They don't even know they don't care about how the soup is made. They just care that the soup was delivered. So in the end, I don't usually worry about trying to communicate it to my community, but it is difficult to communicate it to juries. But, part of it is jury instructions. We have, and to be honest, the more difficult person to communicate this to is the filing deputy. So what happens is we often would hit a snag where the DA who's going to try the case, we think the case is winnable. But we can't get the DA's supervisor to file it. We've had to go with some of these to grand jury because the DA thought you can't win this. And we're thinking, no, we can win this. This is a strong case. And a lot of that is just that DAs, for the most part, remember, the dirty little secret is that DAs are elected officials. And as elected officials, they run on their success rate. If there's a perception in the community that the crime is high, well, DAs have a hard time getting reelected. If their perception in the community is that they've got crime taken care of, and they can show it statistically. So they can say, yeah, we win 97% of the cases. Well, the reason why they win 97% of their cases is they only file about 40% of the cases that are presented to them.
They only file the slam
To
dunks.
me, it's an amazing stat that they lose the 3% because they're not filing cases they don't think they can win. So the problem with that, of course, is that why would they want to file a case that has been forgotten for 30 years? There's no public pressure on this case. No one even remembers the case. Why would they want to file that case when the best case scenario is they win a case that nobody was paying attention to anyway? And the worst case scenario is they lose a case that then becomes the focus of public attention because they lost a case that they put a lot of money in. So it's really hard to get DAs to file these old cases. And so that's where you have the first, it's not the jury. Juries, we've never lost a case. Juries convict on circumstantial evidence that's cumulative. But not every DA is going to file a case that is circumstantial and cumulative.
They want the slam dunk.
Yeah, they want where any, to be honest, where 12 idiots would say, yes, he's guilty.
When we're talking about a case where witnesses and investigators and other people are out of the picture, probably deceased, we're very much talking about a cumulative case. Can you define that for me? Can you explain, what you mean by a cumulative case? And
so there's two forms of evidence, and people think, well, do you have any hard evidence? I hear this expression a lot. There is no such thing as hard evidence. There's only two forms of evidence: direct evidence and indirect evidence. Indirect evidence is also known as circumstantial. And without going into the details, what it comes down to is direct evidence is eyewitness testimony. Anytime an eye can report directly some fact. Now, the eye could also be the eye of a camera, a lens. So video evidence is direct evidence. Now, it has to be tested. You don't just trust eyewitnesses, and people will say, well, that's the most unreliable form of evidence. Well, untested, you got to test eyewitnesses. You don't trust them blindly. Right. And we have a template. We have a series of questions that juries are instructed with. And if you test your eyewitness, you can develop a certain level of certainty about the reliability of that eyewitness based on the test. Now, I don't have direct evidence cases because they are cold for a reason. They were lame to begin with. Yep. So I have to build it a different way. Now, remember, everything that's not an eyewitness is indirect. So like DNA evidence, that's indirect evidence. Mm-hmm. And so you might think, well, there's like direct is good and indirect is not as good. That's not the way it works. Fingerprints are indirect evidence, gunshot residue, ballistic evidence, blood spatter evidence. This is all indirect evidence. Mm-hmm. And this evidence can be quite compelling, especially when you have large amounts that all point to the same suspect. It becomes overwhelming. So you're building this cumulative series of evidences, all of which point to the same suspect. That's how we convict these cases, because we just didn't happen to have an eyewitness who saw it. And that's just the nature of the kinds of cases we work. And we've never lost a case. And judges tell jurors all the time that they're to treat direct and indirect evidence with the exact same level of reliability. I mean, it have to be tested. And we do that.
And that's not what people see on TV.
Right.
It's talked about in a different way.
And that's why a lot of our cases made it on Dateline, because Dateline loves the idea. These cases, they love the fact that, this is impossible. There's no way you can know for sure. There's some level, they would say, some level of doubt. Of course, those are the cases they want to feature. Where you can pause at the commercial and there's no way,
Right.
So that's the kind of cases we ended up. That's why I think we ended up on. If we had, for example, a homicide where we had 4 witnesses who saw him do it, how much that's a 5-minute case.
So Dateline was actually taking advantage of the fact that people don't understand a reasonable doubt
Yeah, well, I can tell you that
versus-
they would ask us, and there were probably 6 or 7 cases that we thought we can do this case if you want, and they looked at it and said, no, if it's too slam dunk, they don't want it either, because they're trying to build a drama.
Right.
They want this to be mysterious. They love it,
Right.
for example, if there's some other suspect you thought was the guy, and at the last minute it switched.
Right.
Well, but that's very few cases, right? I mean, lots of
Right.
times the evidence points to a certain guy, and the question is, can we make the case? They want a reveal. I mean, any of these shows, they want a reveal. If they say there's 6...
It's entertainment.
Yeah, there's 6 chapters in this particular hour, or there's 4. Well, they want the reveal in the last chapter, right? They want that last segment to be the one where well, that's not the way some cases work. Sometimes you got a guy who it's him. You've known it's him from the very beginning. But you've had struggles and challenges, and then you assemble this larger and larger and larger case, and at some point it reaches a tipping point that you think no jury now is going to have a problem determining that it's him.
But I assume that you had a case or two, once you're able to get to Dateline, that you were going down one road, and then you realized that you got into it. No, we've been looking in the wrong place.
Well, and I've only had one really like
really,
that. Yeah, and so that's why, and that's and actually that's the one case for whatever reason Dateline didn't take that case. But,
of course.
So
of course.
so it's weird that the ones they picked, but I think a lot of it was too is they start to trust you. Like a lot of this is not just is the case really good. It's are the people involved in the case good enough communicators that they can tell the story in a compelling way? And I'm sure there's a lot of us who do this work, we're not thinking about it in terms of can we present the case well? We're not prosecutors. Most of us are just detectives. And that doesn't necessarily make for a great interview. I'll be honest. And so a lot of it was, hey, do we have somebody over there who can tell this story in a compelling way? And so that's, I think, a lot of the reason why, that's what I loved about working to help the DAs present the case to the jury. We're trying to figure out, how do we present this case in a compelling way? We want jurors, 2 things. 1, be certain this is the guy. 2, be so certain and so upset about this that you render the verdict quickly. Because what you don't want, that time doesn't help you if you're on the prosecution side of this. You want them to make the decision to be certain he's the guy, but also to be so convicted about it that you want the verdict to come back quickly. And that serves you well. And that's what we tried to do in our presentations.
Your investigation into cold cases, your investigation into robberies and murders and the other things that you did during your law enforcement career, you took some of those same tools and applied it to something in your life. When you were a younger cop, you were not a person of faith, and that changed for you. Can you explain to me how that happened?
Yeah, my wife, we had young kids and we weren't raised around people who went to church. So she thought, well, should we teach our kids this? I mean, at some point you start to wonder, is this an important aspect of life that we should teach our kids, given the fact that we have no background over there? And so I would have said no, because that wasn't the way I grew up. But Susie was, I think, more adamant about let's at least look at it. Also, I think that early on, a lot of preschools are church-related preschools. And I think we did have our kids at a preschool, getting them ready for kindergarten, and that happened to be a church-related preschool. Although I was not a believer, and she wasn't either. So this was a Baptist preschool. We just kind of dropped them off and picked them up, and never really thought much about it. But we moved into this neighborhood, and about 3 years after we were here, she had been wanting to go check out some local churches, and so I thought, okay. I waited I tried to discourage her just by dragging my feet. But eventually, we did go to a local church, and I would have been happy. My dad is a very committed atheist, and he has never really flinched much. I kind of think once in a while I think maybe he will, but usually I'm disappointed. But he'd be the kind of person, though, who would go with you to church, because he would have said, hey, it is valuable. It's a useful delusion. So he would go as an atheist.
Officer also.
Yeah,
right?
He's also a police officer, right? So I would have done the same thing that my dad did. I would have been happy to go to church, even though I didn't think it was true. So I went, and the pastor that first day just happened to say something that provoked me. He said that Jesus was the smartest man who ever lived. And I seriously doubted that, but I wanted to see what that basis for that was. And so I bought a Bible so I could examine it just to see what's so smart about Jesus. Now, what's interesting is you have a series of reports in this book that are written by people who are making claims about something that happened in the past at a particular time in history, at a particular location on the planet, involving a particular set of people. And I have no access to the report writers, and I have no access to the people who they are reporting. That's exactly what you do in cold cases. That's exactly what you do in every case that's unsolved. And I knew there was a bunch of these. And this is, by the way, I did this before I became a cold case detective because I knew eventually I'd be working some of these cases because my dad had several unsolved murders. And in my mind, I always thought I knew exactly the ones I was going to work. So I was interested in developing that skills, and I was working fresh homicides. So I knew that eventually we'd be putting our toe in this. And I knew how we verify witnesses. So I just applied the same skills that ultimately I used in all those cases on Dateline. And I started examining the New Testament claims. You have 4 eyewitnesses, allegedly. 2 who claim to be eyewitnesses historically have been seen as eyewitnesses, Matthew and John. 2 who are report writers, allegedly, for eyewitnesses, allegedly. Mark reporting for Peter, Luke reporting for everybody else. So I wanted just to test those documents and see, using the same skill set, that there's like 4 legs to eyewitness reliability. And so I just spent the next 9 months to a year just examining the Gospels. But of course, a lot more than that, because I was not somebody, I didn't even think there was a God. So forget about the Christian God. I would have said that there is no God, period. So I needed to first look at that issue. So I spent a lot of time just kind of looking at what the evidence was. And ultimately, that's how I ended up becoming a Christian, was just by examining evidentially the claims of Christians. I figured everyone did that. I thought that if you're a Christian, you must have done that. But you're laughing like I guess everybody else is.
No.
It turns out nobody does that.
No, it hurts my heart as a church pastor that so many people kind of fall into Christianity because the people around them, and they don't ever examine it.
Well, and you know what I've discovered? People really are evidential. But what they count as evidence is what's the difference. So they want to have look, our direct experiences as eyewitnesses, that's direct evidence. And people, I have a high regard for direct evidence. And so what people will do is they'll say, I've had a set of experiences that I can explain no other way, except that God is real and that Christianity is true. And what they will gather in their own set of experiences, I would have said as an atheist all along, those are coincidences, dude. Those are not God things. And they would say, well, no, the odds are too great. No, I would say that's ridiculous. So I think we're all evidentialists in some way, but what we would count as evidence is the thing
not very good example.
Right.
The Bible's not true just because it makes you feel good.
Right.
You know, it's true for other reasons that you could potentially test. And you approached it as a cop and said, you know, I'm going to look at this. I'm going to test this. I'm going to ask tough questions and see if it passes. Right. Was there something that maybe surprised you in your investigation into the existence of God or the veracity of the New Testament? Was there something that you thought, well, this is definitely not going to pass the test, and you had, you know, maybe an early surprise?
Well, I think that one of the things early on that impressed me was the fact that it was not a set of random claims. Because if you think about other theistic systems, they don't often make claims about history. So Buddhism does not make claims about history. Mormonism does. You could actually test those claims. I had a sociology teacher in high school who I really admired, and he knew I was a pretty vocal atheist, even as a high schooler. And so he said, hey, you should read the writings of Baha'u'llah. I bet that would change your mind. So he gave me the writings. He was Baha'i, and he gave me the writings of Baha'u'llah, and I read them, and they were quite beautiful, so beautiful. In fact, I used to put them on the wall of my bedroom, but I did not believe they were from the mind of God. I just thought that ancient people sometimes have ancient wisdom, like fortune cookies. So, I mean, I'm fine. That's how I considered it. And that is pretty much how other theistic systems make claims. How would you test the writings of Baha'u'llah? You can't. He's making no claims about history that can be tested. He's just making proclamations about human nature, about, okay, well, anyone could observe those. And that's what I kind of thought Jesus would be talking about. But when I read the Gospels and discovered that they were actually claims about the first century area around Jerusalem where Jesus did his ministry, well, now that's different. There are characters, historical figures that are mentioned. There are regions that are mentioned. These can be verified, right? You know, by the way, the Book of Mormon mentions a 1,000-year period of history from 600 BC to 400 AD in the North American continent, in which regions are described, cities are described and named, Famous people within those cities are named. People groups are named. Military systems and weaponry and coin systems, all of which are described, none of which have ever been discovered archaeologically. So when you make claims that are rooted in history, there's usually a footprint that will allow us to at least to begin to corroborate those claims. And I don't expect to corroborate every claim, but when you find you can't corroborate any claim, you ought to be suspicious. And that was one of the things that I thought was also the fact that the 4 accounts did not match perfectly was powerful to me. Look, I didn't care about inerrancy, that infallibility, that stuff was Christian stuff. I was more concerned about didn't know. I needed to know, were they reliable?
Right.
And reliability is very different. Now, I do believe today as a Christian in the inerrancy of Scripture, but when I first started this, that was not my goal, is to figure that out. I mean, I just needed to know. And I've never had 4 eyewitnesses to any crime, if it's 2 hours ago or 2 decades ago, who ever agreed. And so when I saw that these accounts were left in their slightly variations, I thought,
each one from their own point of view.
Yeah, that's good, because I would be more suspicious if they all had no variations. And so the variations was what provoked me to even begin the investigation at all.
Yeah. Was that or something similar to that the tipping point where you went from, okay, it's not that you had an answer to every single question,
right,
but you reached a point where you got beyond a reasonable doubt.
Yeah, that's right. So that's the problem, is people will say, well, what was the thing? And what you discover when you do these cumulative cases, especially in front of juries. So what we'll do is we'll get the verdict, and then we'll ask the jury, hey, if you can stay and give us another couple of hours, we want to debrief you. And probably 60 or 70% will stay behind. And then we'll sit down and we'll ask those kinds of questions. So where do we mess up? Where did we stumble? Where did you have doubts? Where did you think the case was weak? Where was it strong? What was the piece of evidence you thought was overwhelming? And we're always surprised and glad we included every little paper cut, because it turns out that what's powerful for some is not powerful to me and is not powerful to others. It's kind of the nature of these kinds of cumulative cases. That just the weight of the case is what's powerful. So that was what was true for me. I got to a point where I'm like, if I had to land this. Now, look, a lot of it was that I had to get over my biases against the supernatural, because that's really... there was a point at which I was like, well, the non-supernatural elements are true and the supernatural elements are a lie. So I really had to ask myself, do I think there's any aspect of the universe that is beyond what can be described with space, time, matter, physics, and chemistry? And if you think about it, even as a non-believer, there are things right now that you would say are immaterial truths about the universe. But the minute you go there, the minute you think there's something more than your brain working right now as you assess this claim, if you think you have a mind, and we all have firsthand experiences of mind, well, you're already now going to have to deal with what we call the problem of mind philosophically, because you can't. How do you get minds from brains? Yeah. Either minds are illusory or we're something more than just physical beings. And I think there's lots of good reasons to believe that we are more than just physical beings. And then once you open that door, you better be prepared to walk through it, because that door opens the world. And this is why, for example, in California, I don't know if you knew that, I'm not sure about where you are, but where we are, if you sell a house in which somebody has died, you have to disclose to the next buyer that somebody died in the house, because they're concerned about ghosts. More people believe in the immaterial reality of ghosts than believe in the existence of God. That's why so many movies like Paranormal Activity are so popular. Yeah. We all think, we don't believe that nonsense, but the minute we hear a strange noise in the house and it's empty, we're like going, oh, right? So we have a sense that the world is more than just the physical realm. And that means if you're a mind in addition to a brain, there's a good reason to believe you're a soul in addition to a body. And I think that opened the door to reading the Gospels in a different way.
Yeah, but I tell you, it's something that's different about you versus a lot of people I know is that you were willing to actually investigate. I think a lot of people have a fear or just a hesitancy to really do the work. They maybe know they ought to, and they make some assumptions, but they're not really willing to make the investment.
I do believe that God has to do something first. That this is the nature. If there is a God and the world is how we think it is as Christians, then that God has more power than Jim Wallace has. And that means that, yes, why was I interested? What? It was because God did something first. And I think a lot of it is that God removed the enmity that I had toward God so that I was willing to even look at the evidence. Because I can tell you, the day before I walked into that church, I just had a conversation with somebody at work who was a believer, and I just knocked down what this guy believed. And so what's the difference? And I think that, to be honest, there's something that happens that you can't really explain. Now, does the evidence point to this? Yes. But it's not an either or thing. It's a both and. And I think that God works in a way that he removes the enmity we have when suddenly we have eyes that are different and we see things differently. If you've ever played Slug Bug, where you see a Volkswagen Beetle and the first one who sees it punches the other one, Slug Bug. Well, if you're going to play that game every day, trust me, you'll start to see how many bugs have been driving by you all the time and you never noticed anymore. You suddenly have bug-sensitive eyes. And I think what happens is at some point, God flips that switch and you now have God-sensitive eyes and you start to see the stuff that's been driving by you all the time and you never paid attention to it. And now suddenly you realize, wow, the case is much stronger than I thought it was.
Let me ask one last question. So there's another outside force that plays on our willingness to investigate this stuff is peer pressure. What was it like going back to work now that you found yourself a believer?
Oh, it was brutal. And it was, because a lot of the people I commiserated with were people who had the same view I had of, look, the people we knew who were Christians, only a couple I can think of. I can think of two on my agency that I knew were believers. Yep. And they didn't have the most respect from people who were on the agency. And if you would have asked them, why is this true? They would never have been able to defend it, not with evidence. That's not how they became believers to begin with. Which I thought was odd, since cops generally have a high regard for evidence. The other group that we met all the time were people who were going taken to jail. Those people, it seemed like 70% of the people who were taken to jail would tell us they were church people. Or their mom would call us afterwards and say, that boy was raised in the church. And I would think, okay.
A lot of good that did.
Yeah, this is ridiculous. And so when you become one of those, well, now you're really going to be the target. What I think is awesome about Christianity is that the Bible describes the world the way it really is, especially when it comes to what was called biblical anthropology. Like, there's a description of humans, and if you were to look right now and do a survey of all of the attributes of human nature that cause human flourishing, if you were just to look at what are 15 attributes of human flourishing, well, you're going to find those are ancient attributes that are on the pages of Scripture. And we're just discovering some of these now and making a big deal out of some of these now based on secular sociological studies. But those attributes are very ancient. And it turns out that the ancients who wrote Scripture knew what is best for humans and how humans can flourish and have lower depression, better mental health, longer lives, better relationships. And these basic principles are very ancient. And so what was great about, as you get into this and you start to look at it, you realize that in the end, people see you flourish. And the partners I had who maybe were hesitant, they got to see what this looks like 10 years in, 20 years in. And I think now they're not going to tease me quite as hard.
I think I've heard you tell a story of you reading your Bible in a car and you thought that you were saved.
Yeah, I had a partner who snuck up on me as I was reading it because I was on a surveillance. We were on a stakeout and we were off the eye. So I'm in the back of a parking lot of a funeral home. And sure enough, he sneaks up on me. If I was a bad guy, he would have killed me. But he caught me reading my Bible because I was so entrenched in trying to learn. And this was still at a time, really, where I would have not necessarily. I'm not even sure if I was baptized yet, but I would have said to him, well, he saw the difference in my life,
right?
So he knew that something had changed, and he was trying to figure out what had changed it, and so he was sneaking up on me to see what I was reading. So in the end, though, I think that what's great about all of this is that we have to be able to leverage this, whatever experience we have as believers, we have to turn this and leverage it so we can help other officers who are struggling. And, now most of my strongest efforts are being made pastoring basically police couples who have experienced trauma, PTSD, and they've had been involved in accidents, either motor vehicle accidents or shootings in which their lives were changed. And Billy Graham Evangelistic Association has a retreat for these kinds of officers, and we've been chaplaining there. And what I've learned from that process is that the things that we struggle with as police officers really about things related to identity, bitterness, humility, things that we all struggle with, but seem to be amplified for police officers. Those are the things that I'm really leaning on what Scripture teaches in those areas, because it turns out, because Scripture describes the world and humans the way we really are. If I have an iPhone and the iPhone, I don't know how to operate it, well, I could certainly go online and learn from Apple how the iPhone works and operate it to its maximum capacity. It turns out if you want to know how this device works best, you have to return to the manufacturer and get all the instructions for it. Well, if we are design creatures, we're going to have to return to the designer to see what the manufacturer says about properly operating the device. Yep. And once you do that, you can help people, because it turns out these basic principles do contribute to human flourishing, even in your marriage.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Jim, thank you so much for sharing your story and for talking to me about cold cases. If people are interested in finding some of the really good stuff that you write and produce, where's the best place to find you online?
Well, we have a website called coldcasechristianity.com where we look at Christianity from a detective's perspective. And the flip side of that is we have a website called thethinbluelife.com. And that's where we look at law enforcement from a Christian perspective. So there's kind of two different directions on the same two issues, law enforcement and Christianity. So hopefully those two sites will be sufficient.
Okay, so coldcasechristianity.com and thethinbluelife.com.
Yep.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jim.
Thanks for having me.
I want to thank Jim for agreeing to talk about cold cases and his own faith. If you're a skeptical person but think you might want to investigate Christianity and the Bible, I'd encourage you to dive right in and pursue that. But I'd also recommend J Warner Wallace as a guide. Coming from his convince a jury background, the books, podcasts, and other material that he produces will be really helpful to you. On the next episode of Hey Chaplain.
And I pulled up on the one side, on the west side of it, and stopped. And I was facing Fifth Street, which is a one-way street. Skid Row, life on the nickel, life on Fifth Street. That's where that comes from.
Yeah.
And so I'm just looking at Fifth Street. I'm looking at the homeless people and the street people, and there's businesses there too. And I'm sitting there and I pull over, and for one of the first times in my life, I actually started to pray on duty because I was so frustrated. And I said, God, I believe that you've given us this case, but I'm stuck. I don't know what I'm going to do, and I'm just crying out to you right now. Of course, this is all silent. I'm just saying this prayer in my head. I'm crying out to you for help. Please. And I look across the street, and I am not kidding. C is walking down the street.
Yeah.
And I still get kind of chills when I think about it. I'm like, oh my gosh. So I throw the car and drive. I pull over. It's a one-way street. I come to a stop. I scare the life out of him. He jumps back because he's like an unmarked police car just pulled up. And I jump out and I go, Mr. C, do you remember me? And he looks at me and he goes, oh, you're that detective that interviewed me.
The views expressed here are the personal views of the host and our guest and do not necessarily represent the views of any law enforcement agency or its components. If you like this episode, please share it with a cop or someone who loves a cop. Thank you for listening to Hey Chaplain, and as always, pray for peace in our city.